I think in 2014 we're at a critical crossroads in history in Aotearoa. Not only are we looking at 200 years since the gospel first came here with that sermon preached at Rangihoa Bay in the Bay of Islands, Christmas Day 1814, but we're also talking about the 175th anniversary of the Treaty of Waitangi. We're also looking at issues of identity, looking at a constitution, and looking at 100 years since the First World War, the Great War. So all of these are momentous events in our country's development. And I think if we look at our history, it's a very colourful history. There's some incredible stories about Māori and missionary heroes of the faith. It's a rich story, and I think if we don't understand the Māori story, if we don't understand the missionary story, we actually take some of the heart out of what it is that has brought us to this point in our nation's discovery of identity, if you like. I wonder whether, if we take the missionary story out, we're simply left with the settler story, government, military, greed. It's just an unresolved story. Whereas if we understand the advocacy role of the missionaries, right from those very early days, standing on behalf of Māori and battling for better conditions because their hospitality was being taken for granted by wayward traders and sealers for a start, and then later on as Māori ran into land issues, it was often people like Octavius Hadfield and Thomas Grace and so many of the other missionaries, Henry Williams and William Williams, who stood beside Māori in order to ensure that they had some form of justice. I think the great problem for Māori was that they were given a treaty in 1840 and not a voice to be able to speak up and say, well, actually our land is disappearing far too quickly. We have no means to be able to say, Tai Ho, let's step back and say, well, where's our equal voice in all of this? And I think that was one of the reasons that Honi Hiki cut those flagpoles down, was because he wanted to have a voice. He'd been promised that trade would be increased. He'd been promised that his mana would be increased along with those of other chiefs in the far north, but pretty soon the taxes on visiting ships was increased, the taxes on goods was increased. He was being taxed for bringing his own waka into Kororareka, and he was saying, hang on, what's going on here? Now the government's gone to Auckland. He had every right to be able to stand up and say, well, this is not what we were promised. So things were falling apart pretty soon after the Treaty of Waitangi, and it's understandable that Māori continue to say we need to have a voice in this affair. We're in this together. Hei iwi tahi tātou is what Hobson said to each Māori chief, and I wonder whether that's been misunderstood, rather than a more inclusive, we're in this together. We two peoples are in this together, as Dame Joan Metcalfe says. I think if we start to look at it like that, we start to realise that we are indeed in this enterprise together, and unless we take time to understand the Māori story, unless we understand the pain that they've been through and that sense of betrayal, I think we miss the story altogether, and it becomes all about treaty settlements and misunderstandings that become so one-sided. Put the missionary story back into it, you can start to see some real colour and some real effort of the church in particular standing with Māori during this critical time of our history. Maybe we've got to get back again to see the church as an equal part of this deal, rather than standing on the sideline and watching the politics play out.